Curtin Radio.
Well, this is going to be very, very interesting. I love visiting Fremantle with the heritage buildings down there. There's so many stories that could be shared, and in fact doing that right now is Jo Darbyshire, who's with he's an historian, I should say, with the Perth Museum. Good afternoon to you, Jo.
Oh, hello. How are you going?
Good, thank you, Jo. One of my favourite places on a weekend to go down there with friends and look at the buildings. I'm in awe of the buildings constantly, actually. And they've all got an incredible story, haven't they?
They have, and the Museum of Perth has been busy down there. We've got a website called Streets of Freo.
Right.
And on that, we've been looking at the history of some of these old buildings, especially in the West End. So we've only really got the West End buildings up on the website at the moment, but we hope to expand that in the future.
Oh, look forward to it, because I look at them in awe. I really do, because they've been so beautifully preserved with the story behind the front door there, and wondering what's inside and what it used to be, and do people live upstairs, and there's all these little mysteries around it.
Look, it's a fascinating place, honestly. I don't know, I don't understand why there's not more movies made about some of the stories and people that lived in Fremantle, particularly around the gold rush era, you know, the 1890s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the information, how did you attain all of this on all of these streets?
Well, we work for the Dole volunteers, and they spend a lot of their time looking at the postal directories. Now, the postal directories are online through the State Library of WA, but it's very difficult to access them year by year. So what we've done is we've managed to download all the information on one building. So we can show you who worked or lived in that building from about 1897 till about 1949. And that's when the postal directories stop. But we've also been getting a lot of information from people that have come in or added on to those dates.
Well, I tell you what, everyone's going to be fascinated because, like I said, the history is absolutely there for Western Australia. We don't tend to go enough into our history, I don't think. We do as much as we can on the program. I wonder if we could look at a few of the identities of the area. Josephina Andanich, is it? Andanach?
I think it's Andanac, yeah.
Andanac, yes, go on.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting how history is often written as if it was all happened to men. And what I'm very interested in is looking at some of those histories again and the women that were actually involved. So at number 68 High Street, which most people would know now as the Buffalo Club.
Yeah.
Do you know the building I'm talking about?
I do, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that used to be the Madrid Hotel or the Madrid Restaurant or the Madrid Coffee Shop. It changed its name, but it was there basically for 70 years before it became the Buffalo Club.
Oh, goodness.
And it's so interesting because it was begun by a Spanish-Catalan immigrant called Francisco Andanac, and his relatives are still alive today, and they've sent me some of the photographs. Now, he came out to Melbourne and then came over to WA and worked in the Spanish restaurant. And we didn't really have a very big Spanish immigrant population here. The only other people were at New Norcia.
Mm-hmm.
And when he wanted a wife, he actually travelled back to Catalan and he ended up marrying his cousin, Josefina or Josefa Matu, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think that's right. She was born in Barcelona in 1880.
Right.
So they married, and she came back with him to Western Australia, and they worked and lived in the Madrid Hotel, and she never left. So she died when she was 92 years old, 92 years old in 1972.
Gosh.
And it's really amazing because when you look at that initial history, it's called the Andanac brothers started the Madrid Hotel, and that's sort of how it's always been presented. But in 1918, Francis had a sort of mental breakdown, I guess you'd call it, and he was taken to the Perth Public Hospital and then the Claremont Hospital for the Insane. And somewhere in there, he was beaten up, basically, when he was in a straitjacket, and he was treated incredibly badly. And he died. So he died in the Claremont Hospital of an Insane. And this was crazy because he was only 47 years old. And after that, there was a big commission into the Claremont Hospital and how it was run, because people were horrified, particularly local people. And one of the councilmen took it up with the government and said, why isn't there going to be a review of this? This is crazy. And in the end there was. They didn't really find, they didn't blame anyone, but basically he was beaten up in the hospital. So it sort of changed the way and hopefully made better conditions at Claremont after that. But that left Josepha with 7 children, and she'd only just found out she was pregnant with another.
Oh, dear.
And left her with the Madrid Hotel. And she took up the challenge and ran it for the next 20 years, until 1939, when it became the Buffalo Club. So she must have been one hell of a woman, I reckon.
I reckon she was, that's for sure. Mind you, back in those days, you didn't have much of a choice, did you? You had to get on with it, that's for sure.
Well, it was a pretty wild place, and the people used to live upstairs in the hotel. So it had a lot of bedrooms, and people used to live there permanently. Some of them died there, and her grandson told me that she actually used to live with a 6-chambered revolver to quell disturbances. So she had to be pretty tough.
A pistol-packing mama.
Yeah. But, why haven't we heard of her before?
Well, you're absolutely
very interesting.
Great. There'd be great documentaries, actually. Now, when I walk past the Buffalo Club now, I will remember that story vividly, and I hope we get to hear a whole lot more. But what about Black Paddy, or Paddy King?
Yes, well, he was another amazing person. When I looked into the history, there's not a lot of history about Aboriginal people. And one of the reasons it's not so obvious is because only really 4 of them were allowed to stay in the Fremantle area, and they were given work permits. This is terrible, isn't it? This is amazing when you find out this information. And Paddy King was an amazing stockman. I don't know, I couldn't find out exactly where he came from, but he was allowed to stay in the area, and he used to live behind the abattoirs down at South Beach there in the Sandhills.
Oh, right.
With another guy who was a great boxer called Nandi.
Yeah.
Wandy. So Wandy's quite well known. They've named a suburb after him. But Paddy is not so well known. But he was very well known when he was alive. Everybody knew who he was because he became quite a famous boxer. So one of the only other ways that Aboriginal men could make money was to do boxing. Yeah. And so he was a skilled stockman, and he was an incredible boxer. So by 1905, he'd earned a really good reputation, and he kept on boxing into his 50s. And he had some kind of license that allowed him to go into licensed venues, and that was because he was a boxer, and they, there was always alcohol served in those venues.
Goodness.
And anyway, he was picked up and by a boxing champ, whoever it is that organises them.
Yeah.
And he was taken to the Eastern States.
What a man.
Charlie Lucas, his name was, a boxing promoter.
Incredible.
In 1912, he took him on a national boxing tour, and there was a lot of racism towards him. He wasn't allowed to stay in hotels, but Charlie Lucas had to fight continuously that he be treated well, properly.
What a life.
And he took a lot of punishment in his day, but he was very well known for never giving up on a fight.
What a bloke.
I know, and in the end, he was, during the First World War, he was left over in Cairns, and he was sort of stuck in Queensland, and he was finally, the Queensland Protector of Aborigines sent him to the Palm Island Aboriginal Institution, which was a terrible penal colony for the Aboriginal people in Queensland. And he kind of got stuck there, and he must have been saying, I come from WA, let me go, but they wouldn't. And finally, Bartholomew Daly, who was a Fremantle council, heard about this and wrote to that Queensland Protector of Aborigines and asked that Paddy be returned. And the people of Fremantle raised the money to bring him back. And Wandy organised that too. And so they paid for him to come back on the train, and he finally came back in 1924.
Goodness me, what a story, what a life, eh? And
I
all
know.
the things he had to put up with, that's for sure. And finally, for today, Hassan Dicton.
Well, he's one of my favourites, actually. I was looking at the Chinese history in Fremantle, which is not very well known. We know that there was Chinese laundries in Pakenham Street, and I don't know if you know Pakenham Street, but it's the only place on Pakenham Street where it's an empty block, which is now a car park.
Yeah.
On the corner of Bannister Street and Pakenham. That was where they used to have the Chinese laundries. And upstairs of those laundries was what was called the Chinese Club. And that Chinese club was often raided for opium. So it's a wild history in Pakenham Street, I can tell you.
Goodness.
And Hassan Dicton arrived sometime in the 1880s, and he was an incredible guy because he could speak English, Japanese and Chinese, and he often acted as a interpreter for the police and the customs agents with Chinese people that were coming into WA. And that's another whole story in itself because, they were highly controlled and policed, and in the end, I think the interpreters were caught between a rock and a hard place and often became informers for the police.
Oh, right.
So they would see someone come in on the boats, they would know they didn't really have a proper contract, and they would let the police know, and then if that person, when they raided Chinese market gardens to see if there was illegal Chinese immigrants, they would find this person, and Hassan Dicton would say, yes, that's the guy I saw come in on such and such a boat. So he was an informer, as well as being an interpreter.
Dangerous line.
Another interesting thing was that he married a white woman. So in those days, it was very difficult. It was forbidden for Chinese men to bring women with them. There was hardly any Chinese women in Western Australia. And so it was a lonely life for these Chinese workers while they fulfilled, say, a 3 or 5 year contract. And so that's why they resorted to the opium dens. And, it was a very difficult life, let's put it that way.
Without a doubt. They were valued, though, weren't they, in a very strange way? I mean, they contributed a lot.
Oh, my God. They had the market gardens.
Yes.
And also Hassan Dicton for a while had a store. So there was a few stores, Chinese stores in Fremantle, had mixed business.
Yeah, good on them.
And he married Martha Catherine Jones, who was a Fremantle girl who had an Irish father. And she came from a big family in Fremantle. And they had 5 children.
Goodness.
So I know. So he was a fixture in Fremantle as well. Constantly in trouble with the police. He was a bit of a naughty boy, I think. Did a whole lot of things. But you can read all about those.
Yes, tell us how people can.
Okay, so you just go to www.streetsoffreo.com.
Yep, Streets of Freo. Yep. .com.
.com, yep. And that's a website you can easily get onto. And then you can see there's a whole lot of different things you can look at. You can look at the West End heritage streets. Fabulous. You can look at the Notre Dame buildings, which ones they've got and occupying at the moment. You can look at the notable and notorious section, which is where we've got some of these histories written, of biographies written of some of the people.
Well, I would imagine that their descendants would probably be very interested in that.
Well, we're always happy to hear from descendants because we don't often, we can make mistakes and we're really happy to rectify those. And what we found with the Streets of East Freo is that a lot of people have contacted us with photos. They want their family history up there on the web, and it's a way for people to do that. So we're always happy to hear from people if they've got something else, they want to add, or they want to write their own biography of their own family member that can go into that section.
And so you're going to be updating all the time, aren't you?
We are. We're constantly updating, yeah.
Jo, look, it's fantastic. I hope we can chat with you again more often in the future to find out a little bit more about the history of these incredible people that made WA and Fremantle what it is today.
I know. Thank you. I hope we can.
Lovely to speak to you, and thank you for that information.
No worries.
Thank you, Jo. Jo Darbyshire.
Curtin